Hey, Literature and Writing 338 students, welcome. All right, so today's lesson is on 20th century American children's lit, and specifically the middle of the 20th century through the end. So last time I told you about two historical contexts that impacted the rise of New Realism: developmental psychology and postmodernism slash post-structuralism. I also suggested some conventions that scholars have noticed in New Realist children's literature. So this time, then, I'm going to cover some additional information on how children's literature develops as a genre. And this is going to allow me the chance to offer you some more conventions that are associated with New Realist children's literature. So here we go. After the Golden Age. The popularity of Golden Age literature ultimately allows it to develop a really solid commercial market for upper and middle class audiences. In turn, children's literature itself then becomes institutionalized. Various awards, like you can see the ones that are pictured here, the Hans Christian Andersen Award, the Newbery Award, the Caldecott Award. These are awards for children's literature and children's illustration. It becomes part of school curriculums. There becomes a sort of national agenda about reading that I remember when I was in the 70s. Reading is fun. And unfortunately, children's literature continues to be dominated by white male authors, which is the same trend that we saw in the Golden Age. Mostly white male authors, some white female authors, but mostly male, mostly white, mostly aristocratic or upper middle class. And you can see here in the statistic that I posted, 1962 to 1964, about 6.7% of books featured characters, BIPOC characters, which is Black, Indigenous, or people of color characters, and less than 1% that did feature those characters featured stories of Black children now, as opposed to like Black children in slave times or that sort of things, or in the past. And you can see that whose study that was on the slide. After the Golden Age solidifies children's literature as a genre, we continue to see things being published in that Golden Age tradition, but something new arises, as I mentioned, as a result of some cultural shifts that are happening in the way that people think about representation that affect the way that literature is produced. So specifically, growing markets, along with the social justice movement, like the 1960s social justice and civil rights movement, begin to allow for a larger diversity of representation. And you have examples of texts that are featuring children of color that aren't being represented in negative or stereotypical ways, which is something that had happened a lot of times in the previous representations. Even when children of color were represented, they were represented often negatively or with stereotypes or in ways that like don't reflect their humanity. As I mentioned, Golden Age style fantasy continues to be published. That doesn't go away. So I've got examples of Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Prydain, of Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea series, which is one of my favorite series of all times. Susan Cooper's Dark is Rising series, which is an Arthurian series for children or young adults. These are all series that I happened to read when I was growing up, and they are very much in that Golden Age legacy. They continue a number of things like the quest narrative, the focus on young protagonists, the posse or buddy that surrounds the main character, like we see in Wizard of Oz with Dorothy, with the lion and the scarecrow and the Tin Man. So all of those things continue, and they continue through New Realism as well. It's not like they disappear and go away, but these other characteristics start to show up in addition to these Golden Age style ones that we've been so used to and that dominate. So the two texts that you see pictured here, Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, which is the pictures of the monsters, and Fitzhugh's Harriet the Spy, which is over there on the right, which came out in 1963 and 1964 respectively. These are often seen as one of the earliest examples of straight up like New Realist children's literature. And some of the things that they did is they dealt with taboo subjects. So subjects that were more formally taboo in the Golden Age became more common. In particular, dealing with issues like sex, dealing with issues of parental relationships. We don't see many parental relationships in the Golden Age literature. Alice's parents aren't around. Dorothy's parents aren't around. We can't really deal with those parental relationships that we saw in The Little Mermaid in the Golden Age because they're just not there. But subjects, for example, like in Where the Wild Things Are, Max misbehaves and gets sent to dinner without supper. Or Harriet the Spy, has a number of problems adjusting to her classmates and ends up going to therapy at the end of the book. So these are things that we're not going to see in a Golden Age text. They're things that maybe come from real life, hence the term realism. Some other texts that you may or may not have heard of are Paul's and Dell's My Darling, My Hamburger, which deals with the question of abortion, or The Island of Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell, which features being left alone entirely on an island. So these are some things that deal with, taboo subjects that come up. Taboo. So then the next convention I'll discuss is the parental involvement in the children's stories. Unlike Golden Age Lit, where we don't really see the parents involved, the parents show up in New Realism. The parents' absence matters. Right? Like, they're interested in the negotiation between the parent and child relationship often. We see that both in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and in A Wrinkle in Time. And since that is one of the most significant relationships in any child's life, the parental relationships, then it stands to reason that those would then be featured in the text. For example, compare the way that the parent's absence is treated in Wizard of Oz to how it's treated in A Wrinkle in Time. In Wizard, the parental absence is part of the backstory, right? We never see Dorothy miss her parents or struggle with her identity as an orphan. We do see her miss her Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, who are her parental figures. But we don't really see any signs of tension or strain in their relationship, at least in the book version, which is the more Golden Age version. So if we compare this to Meg's missing dad, his absence generates pain for her on a daily basis, and she struggles with her identity when he's not there. She fights people because of him. This is an example of an approach that has more realism, where Meg's relationship with her mom is positive but not perfect, but then her dad turns out not to be able to save the day. She still loves him, but he turns out not to be the perfect idealized dad she had in her mind. Again, this idea of realism. Finally, one of the things that we see in New Realist texts, as opposed to Golden Age texts, is that the problems that the protagonists have to solve in some of these Golden Age texts don't arise in the real world. The problems are things that happen in the fantasy world. So for Alice, the problem is she wants to get into that garden. She wants to see that garden. That doesn't really have anything to do with her real life, where her problem is she's bored, which isn't much of a problem, honestly. Although, we've been all a lot bored this past year, and so maybe it doesn't feel like a luxury right now. Same thing with Dorothy. She doesn't seem to have huge issues in the real world, although in the film they changed this up a little bit. But in the book, she's happy. The Toto keeps her happy. Her life is gray, but it's okay. And then whoop, a tornado takes her away. So her only problem is that she needs to get home, and every other thing that arises in the fantasy world. So if we compare that then to Meg or Charlie from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Meg's problem is her dad's absence, right? And that originates in the real world, not in the fantasy world. She has to go to the fantasy world to fix it, but her problem originates in the real world. Likewise, same thing with Charlie from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. His poverty originates in the real world. That's a real problem that he's dealing with. But his journey to the fantasy other world, the Chocolate Factory, is what solves the problem. So Wrinkle in Time and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which are an American and a British text from this early 60s period of New Realism, they're pretty good examples of early 60s lit and of this mid 20th century time period, because they have both New Realist and Golden Age features. So the Golden Age influence doesn't disappear, but these new conventions come up with it. So we still see this journey to the other world, that sort of thing, but it's contextualized with the real world problem. As the century wears on, and as New Realism and realism in children's literature starts to become more common, then we see it develop into more extreme or shocking versions. We see more and more taboo subjects coming up. Taboo! Yeah. So this trend intensifies, basically, with things getting more extreme. If we think about Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, it's about religion and her lack of belief, or her parents' lack of belief. And then Forever is about a teenage girl who is becoming sexual for the first time. So I remember when I read Forever, it was either middle school or early high school. I can't remember specifically, but it was kind of scandalous. Everyone was like, have you read Forever? Oh my gosh, it's sexual. And it sounds really sort of quaint and cute now, given what you all have access to on the internet at any given time. But for me, that was one of the first times I had read a book that dealt with sex of a teenager. I mean, I had read like Harlequin romances, which are not so super realistic. But Judy Blume's Forever actually featured a teenage girl having like her first fumbling attempts at sexuality with her teenage boyfriend, which felt very real to me at the time as someone who was also a teenager reading it. So, The Outsiders deals with a group of teenagers who are in, I mean, I don't know if you'd call it a gang or not, but it's a group of boys who are bonded together and get involved in some violence, and some of them are unhomed and unable to live with their parents, and it deals with kind of a lot of like realistic sort of situations that kinds of super impoverished teenagers are going to find themselves in, especially depending on where they're growing up and in what kinds of circumstances. A couple of other examples of shocking texts from the 1970s is in 1972, Go Ask Alice is a anonymous diary that represents a woman's experience with drugs and mental illness. And then in 1979, V.C. Andrews' Flowers in the Attic, which has been made into a couple of different movie versions and features incest. Dun, dun, dun. I loved it. It was one of my favorite books. So then the other thing that happens is we finally start to see a little bit of traction on pushing more towards diversity. You've got an example of Virginia Hamilton's MC Higgins the Great, which won the Newbery Medal in 1975. But so we do see increase from the 60s to the 70s in terms of diversity of representation, if not fully diversity of authorship, from what was 6.7% up to 14.4% in the next decade. Unfortunately, that's not going to continue. So in the 1980s, then, sees a number of things happen. First off, we start to see, even with The Outsiders and Judy Blume, that new realism paves the way then for what's going to become the genre known as young adult literature. Because it starts to deal, since it's dealing with more mature subjects, it's aimed at more mature audiences. And then eventually that trend develops like sort of full blown into its own literature for teenagers as something that's separate than children. And that becomes young adult literature then. So then the next thing that we also see happening in the 1980s is we get beginning reader picture books starting to proliferate. So what we see happening then in the 80s is more stratification of children's literature. Not only do we have picture books and chapter books, and now we're starting to have young adult books, and also like the early reader, the board book type of thing. We're starting to see niche audiences, again based on this developmental psychology, right? We're gonna target kids at each age in a different way. And then one more thing I want to point out is that serialized books continue to be very, very popular and selling very well. So you can see here, one of my favorite series was the Choose Your Own Adventure series. I used to love those. And then Babysitter's Club, Sweet Valley Twins, all those sorts of serialized texts from the 1980s continue to be very popular. And unfortunately, though, diversity of representation ends up decreasing. In 1985, less than 1% of the books. So we went from 14% back down to 1%. That actually kind of mirrors the political trajectory of the country. In the 60s and 70s tended to be a little bit more progressive. The 1980s tended to be a little bit more conservative. It was a little bit of a backlash to the wild and crazy 70s. You can always see that our two-party system is a pendulum swinging back and forth. So we swing back a little bit in the 1980s, you see. All right, and that brings us to the end of the 20th century, which is the 1990s. That brings us to the Harry Potter phenomenon. Harry Potter phenomenon. All right, so there is, in fact, a huge publishing explosion then in the 1990s. Harry Potter is one of the huge texts that starts this publishing explosion. There's a lot of other series. I've listed a few of them here for you as well. You probably know many more from the 1990s and on. Unfortunately, diversity of representation still lags behind American demographics. Miklos says that during the mid-90s, it was around 2% of representation of BIPOC characters. This fascination with these sort of big, huge series that sell more than their adult counterparts continues through the 2000s. And we'll get into that in the next unit, because that's when young adult literature comes to reign supreme. And that we'll be talking more about that in unit 4. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.